Israel has reached a new part of its early history. In Genesis, we had the time of the patriarchs, from Abraham to Jacob, which concluded with Jacob and his sons settling in Egypt. Next, we have the Exodus under the leadership of Moses, which covers leaving Egypt, receiving the law at Sinai, and the wilderness wanderings. They are now at the cusp of entering, conquering, and settling in the promised land, which they will do under new leadership, that of Joshua. From that point, Israel's history will enter the period of the Judges, the last of which will be Samuel, who will transition to the monarchy under Saul and then David, which will last down to the exile. At the end of Israel's wanderings comes this itinerary summarizing their journey in chapter 33. Ancient peoples kept records of their doings, especially wars, which would include not only the people conquered, but the stops along the way in the campaign. We have references to such books here and there in the Old Testament, and have already seen a lost book called the Book of the Wars of the Lord in Numbers 21, 14 to 15, and perhaps verses 17 to 18 as well. Other lost works include the Book of Yashar, mentioned in Joshua 10 and 2 Samuel 1. Much material in 1 and 2 Kings comes from 2 lost chronicles, those of kings of Judah and the kings of Israel, which those books repeatedly refer to. There is also an example of annals or chronicles in Esther 6:1, which the king had read to him when he could not sleep. This travel itinerary in chapter 33 is quite sparse and seems mainly just to relate the basic information in order. The Red Sea and Mount Sinai are mentioned, but the momentous events which happened there are not described. Mount Nebo is also mentioned, which will be the site of Moses' death and burial, but this is not said either. An exception to the simple reporting is the first Passover, where it is emphasized that the Lord judged the gods of Egypt. Also given space is the death of Aaron. Other than that, the 40-year itinerary is listed quite plainly, not even commenting on the rebellions. Indeed, Massah and Meribah are not even recorded here. Chapter 34 looks forward to the things which will happen in the book of Joshua, when the land is conquered and apportioned. Eleazar the high priest and Joshua will supervise this process. The tribes will fit into the land by the natural borders of the River Jordan on the east and the Mediterranean on the west, although this will only be 10 of the tribes, as we saw in chapter 32 that Reuben, Gad, and half of Joseph, which is Manasseh, will inherit the land east of the Jordan. The overall boundaries given here correspond to Egyptian records as to the extent of Canaan, though in fact Israel never attained to these limits. These instructions, therefore, turned out just to be ideal. Over the centuries, Israel's borders would expand and shrink with their fortunes. Under Solomon, they would expand to their greatest limits, thanks to David's unrivaled military power. And during the intertestamental period, the Hasmonean dynasty would expand their control to nearly the same proportions. But Israel's sovereignty and peace always depended upon their commitment to the Lord, and therefore on their relationships with their neighbours. Foreshadowing these troubles, the Lord warns Israel to completely drive out the current occupants of Canaan, because if they do not, they will be a continual problem, as indeed they proved to be. When Israel was led astray into idolatry, the Lord disciplined them with the gradual removal of his protection, so that these neighbours oppressed them. It would have been better if Israel could have cleared out the land entirely. But God's plan to bless a people can never rely on their worthiness or capacity to behave. It must always be rooted in his own faithfulness, or else who could be saved?